Hello and welcome to the Temple Tinkered. I am Jim, aka Argent Wind, and I am your host here for DM&D Chat, where we talk about all things Dungeons and Dragons and running Dungeons and Dragons, especially, but D&D and beyond. Uh, Today we're going to be talking about villains, those bad guys in your campaigns, things to make your players really sink their teeth in and go after, and people that are just going to be a real pain in the butt for your players to deal with. But before we get that going here, I do want to mention again, as always, our Discord server, House of Gamers, is always looking for more players and especially more DMs. So if you're watching this show and you're thinking, "Hey, I could run a game," hop on there, go to our D&D campaigns channel, and post a. You want to just do some one shots or very short campaigns. Anything to get some more things happening. We have new one starting up, and another one in kind of the planning stages, and potentially one more beyond that. So if you're looking to be play we're looking for a time slot to be a DM. We're happy to have more people on there and get this thing rolling really well. So I'm not sure if you're out there in chat, but make sure you say hi. And at any point, if you have questions along the way, throw them in chat there. About halfway through, how we do this is about halfway through our hour together here. I'll start taking questions from the chat. And if you load them in there ahead of time, we'll have a little bit less downtime. Just to remind you, you are about maybe 10 to 15 seconds in the past for me. So if I ask for something, I might not see it for a little while. So feel free to throw them in there as soon as you can. Also, I do run a D&D campaign that streams on this channel on Saturdays at 2 o'clock Pacific time. So feel free to hop in and check out what's going on over there. It's Avarice, the Shattered World, homebrew world of my own making there with some great players. And we've been playing for coming up on a year pretty soon, a little over 10 months now. Actually, almost 11 months at this point. So love to have you there. Check things out and join us for some fun times. But today, we are talking about villains. And we're talking everything from the annoying little pest to the BBEG themselves, the big bad evil guy, who may be running all the terrible things that are happening to your party. They're trying to destroy the world or take over the world or do something. But the fact is, your villains are going to be what really draw those events in the campaign. Um, when you have things bad that are happening, people are being kidnapped or murdered, or things are being stolen, or all these things are happening, the party's going to end up trying to deal with and investigate and maybe stop. A lot of times, it's going to be a villain behind it in some way. Maybe a villain organization. It could be multiple people. It could be one big bad guy with a whole bunch of people working for him. Regardless, there's always ways to make your villains more interesting and to really make them stand out for your players and drive events in your campaign as well. Now, what makes a good villain? Well, there's a lot of schools of thought around this. And this first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of up for debate. But I bring it up because it is, I feel, a really important thing for your villains. So, first of all, it is motivation. I mean, what drives your villain? What do they want? What are they after? Um, Now, this is something that may be relevant for your players. They don't necessarily need to know what your villain is after. They may not never realize it, or may never know the extent of it. But if you know what the motivation is, it's going to help you design things that the villain is going to be doing. If they want to destroy the world, they're going to be finding ways of causing destruction and problems and summoning up armies of things to overrun things or causing environmental disasters. All kinds of things can happen there with a villain whose motivation is just to destroy. If they're a opponent who wants to take over the world, maybe there's more of a political bent there. They're trying to infiltrate city guards or trying to infiltrate like the ruling faction of a city or a country. And again, that power hungry, I want to take things over. Or are they a crime boss? Maybe they want to rule the underworld and do all kinds of things that would be involving like the drug trade or anything else that might be happening or just stealing everything they can. So there are always so those motivations really drive the kinds of things that they're into. And again, you're probably going to have multiple villains. You may not just have one villain. It might be a dozen or so. They may not know each other, they may not work together, but they all have their own ends and what they're trying to accomplish. And how the party interacts with them is really part of the campaign. What are they trying to stop? Maybe they ally with one villain to take down a different one. There's all kinds of things you can do with your villains if you know what they want. So the motivations can be complicated. They can be all having their hands in all kinds of things. They have all kinds of minions doing everything all over the globe, or they can be very, very focused. And that thing that they're trying to accomplish there is a big thing the parties are trying to discover and thwart their plans. So the motivations can be complicated or simple. Um, and that's going to basically be how you know what to do with those villains. So motivation is a big key. What else that makes a good villain are layers. And I'm going to use the homonym thing because I'm talking about layers, like ogres and onions have layers, and layers as in where do they live, where do they work, where do the things happen. So they're layers. Most villains don't work alone. At the very least, they got minions and henchmen working for them. They've got maybe lieutenants and generals. Maybe they've got different sub-villains, essentially, that do operations in various places. Maybe a villain that you have is, you think the big bad evil, but he's actually working for someone else who's even worse. And so the party might discover one villain and then turn around and find out that there's somebody else beyond them. This person's just a general. This person's just a captain. Heck, this person might be just a sub-villain compared to the main guy. So again, that really draws a campaign out too, because what the party thinks is the person they're trying to deal with now leads to something else and then something else and something else. And they're working their way up a chain of bad guys until they get to the real bad guy who's behind it all. So again, the layers you they give depth to what the villain is trying to accomplish. It also can make them really interesting. Some of the villain some true villains, their henchmen are more fun than the villain themselves. I mean, frankly, to me, I was always more interested in Vader than I was in the Emperor. He was just an old guy who was kind of creepy and weird, where Vader was a real major badass with doing all kinds of stuff. But that's the whole thing, is that the layers you add in there can really make a broad spectrum of people for that party to deal with. So villains really work, like I said, they really work alone. So maybe their allies and henchmen have a theme to them or certain types. If your big bad is a necromancer, then they're going to have like a bunch of undead or like vampires or liches, or maybe the thing is a lich. All kinds of things can happen under someone who has that as their focus. Whereas the crime boss is going to have a bunch of thieves and bandits and strange, more trickster type people under them, possibly. Um, think about your classic villains, like from comic books. Um, you have, you have the villains like Lex Luthor, who have a whole bunch of minions. Nobody's as powerful as him, but he has a whole bunch of people that do things for him. And maybe he has people that are using his things that he's bought or created to cause havoc. Whereas the Joker has a bunch of idiots running around with tire irons and clown masks who cause problems everywhere they go and blow things up. So the idea that the villains' layers, like the layers of people they have working under them, can really broaden what they do and accomplish within the world. A single person can only do so much. When you have a whole group of people under them, they can be in multiple places at once. They can cause problems on different levels of things. So again, that villain, the layers of that villain add to to the threat that they pose to the party, to the world. And it lets you vary power levels. When the parties are starting off, you may not want to drop the main bad guy on them, or they may see the main guy doing something, but they can't deal with it yet. But they can deal with his subordinates, his henchmen, his lower tier villains, that they can work their way up. And so your campaign has a natural progression of moving through bad guys until they get to the worst one. Or again, the next one in the chain, and it allows you to to bring in different flavors of villains as well. Maybe this necromancer is the big bad, and he's got a lich working for him, or he is a lich and he has something else working for him. But maybe he has a bunch of like death cleric occultists running around who want to kill things and raise them. Or maybe there's just someone who's just a crazed serial killer running around there in trying to trying to make a name for himself, so the big guy will notice him. There's all kinds of things you can do when you have varying levels of villains. Um, so, and it makes it sort of interesting for the players to figure out maybe who's in charge, who really is the one running pulling the strings. That's a big thing the party can work toward as they move through this thing and find pieces and deal with problems and find out how they're related and everything. So again, that's kind of a fun thing that having a layered structure for a villain or villain organization, especially can really help add to the party, add to the campaign. And then, of course, there's the layers themselves. Most villains have a cool place to hang out. May have multiple places to hang out. A mountain fortress in an active volcano, or a floating city in the clouds, or some underground sewer layer with steeping with acid and crazy vats of stuff, and who knows what else. But all of those things make up sort of it can tie into the overall aesthetic of your villain, the overall kind of motivation for your villain. Whereas if they have this place to go, there's a place the players have to discover and work their way to and find out. And sneaking into the place, trying to deal with minions before they get caught. There's all kinds of things that can happen there with the villain's lair. And villains can have multiple layers. Obviously, maybe they have a general who's in a abandoned fortress somewhere, and they've got a bunch of lieutenants running around in some seedy tavern in one of the big cities in the area. Maybe they have patrolling groups of bandits that are just causing problems for people. All of these things add up to a larger villain, and all of those locations are then layers that the players get to experience. And maybe there's a common theme between all of them, a common banner or a common type of activity that's done there. And a good layer also adds itself to a villain having layer actions, which can add a whole new dimension to combats that take place there. So those layer actions and those layers kind of become almost an extra character unto itself. That necromancer stronghold may have undead things popping up everywhere, or these strange obelisks that drain life from people and feed it into various minions. Or there's all kinds of things you can do when you have a villain with a theme and a motivation and henchmen and a layer to work with. All of these things kind of go together to make up a good villain. And remember, when it comes to henchmen and minions, he's got all kinds. They never really run out. The more the merrier when it comes to henchmen and minions and henchmen for a villain. They never seem to stop coming until you finally deal with the main bad guy. And then who knows? Maybe somebody that survives becomes a villain for somebody else, maybe in a future campaign. You have a tie into a previous campaign where now that lieutenant that got away is now the big bad for somebody else to deal with. So again, seeds you can use throughout your campaign or throughout multiple campaigns. Um, so how do you get your villain in front of the players? Well, there's a couple different ways. First of all, it can be sort of a mysterious thing of the people like finding out a problem and then finding out something else and then realizing there's a connection there. And maybe there's some sort of like a shared um, communication or messages that are being sent back and forth that the players manage to intercept and realize that, hey, these guys are working with these guys and these guys are working for somebody else. And so you now have these connections that kind of add sort of a mystery for the players to figure out what is happening here and what are all these elements that may or may not be related. And so you can kind of hint toward there being a villain they have to deal with, Or you can just drop the villain on them right away. Or the villain destroys a town, or the villain does something horrible like this, like kills off a royal family and takes over a kingdom. And now the party knows about this, and they're going to try to work their way up to figure out how maybe they can deal with it, maybe they can't, maybe they just become a thorn in that villain's side until they can deal with them eventually down the road. But again, the way you reveal the villain kind of depends on what you're going for in your campaign, in the story you're trying to tell. And so you might want to reveal a little over time, or make the big reveal and sort of work out how are we going to get there? Because obviously taking on the big bad right off the bat, um, Skyrim, you see Anduin right off the bat there. Dragon comes in there, levels the place, and then you run around there learning what's going on and eventually dealing with the problem. But you have to work your way up to it. Um, so that kind of a thing where the villain is there, but it's there, not here, because obviously campaign's over if the villain sees the party right off the bat. Um, so again, what story you're trying to tell depends on the approach you're going to use with your villains. It could be maybe the party is working for a rival villain. Like maybe the thieves guild in a place is maybe corrupt or something like that, but the party are like low ranking members of the thieves guild, but they're dealing with a corrupt city official or a corrupt king within a kingdom, and these little lowly thieves from some organization, maybe they take over the organization and oust the bad guy from there, and then use that to move their way up through things. Again, a whole campaign dealing from how do we deal with villains? How do we deal with our problem that we're running up because of them? Um, and that keeps the party guessing. They never quite know exactly what's going to happen out there or where things are going, or and that's part of the fun, is figuring all that out or learning where it comes from, and then eventually working their way up to dealing with the BBEG. Um, so um, again, put some thought into your villains. Don't be afraid to make them super powerful. Don't be afraid to make them uh, less powerful, but have more resources that make them more of a threat. There's all kinds of ways you can do that. But when it comes to creating your villains, think about what resources they have. Are they magical resources? Are they people resources? Are they magical items that they have? Is it just money and they've got a amazing place that they can hole up in and defend themselves in? Um, or do they have some sort of outside interference? Maybe they're allied to a god who's feeding them power. But I'm going to come back to that a little bit there with a question there. So, but um, the idea that the villain may not be as bad as they think they are, but because of the resources they have, and that may be part of the campaign too, is figuring out how to circumvent those resources or certain or to weaken the villain so they can deal with him. Again, there's all these fun ways the party can work their way up to dealing with a bad guy. Um, and so, whatever they come up with, whatever they find, eh, the, and the fun part is, you know what's going on. You know what's happening behind the scenes. So if you have a good handle on your villain and their activities and what they're going for, the party sort of like starts to figure that out and wind their way through it there. But since you know what's happening, you can really control what's happening behind the scenes. Villains aren't just sitting there waiting for the party to show up and kill them. They have things they're doing. They have plans. They have things that are hatching out there. And maybe the party gets to thwart some of those plans along the way and make themselves that thorn in the villain's side. The villain then tries to deal with them. And so you have these cool plot elements that start to grow and build from how do we deal with this guy? So um, we're going to jump into some questions here, but hopefully some more people out there. If you have some questions there, throw them out here. But we'll come back to some things as well. Um, so First question I see, what makes a BBEG sympathetic yet menacing? Assuming that what you're going for. Well, again, maybe the motivation for a villain is something that does get revealed to the players. Maybe they're after revenge. Maybe they're trying to right the wrong, but they're doing it in a bad way. So what can make a villain sympathetic is if what they're doing maybe isn't as bad as it seems. Maybe that villain turns out to be someone who's trying to deal with something else that's worse. And again, so the idea that the party might say that, hey, this guy's maybe his 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 actions aren't very good, but his motivation is spot on. Let's see if we can either turn him in the right direction or defeat him and take over his things to deal with to go for somebody else. So so what makes them sympathetic can be the fact that they may be justified in what they're doing. They may be out for revenge. They may be out for righting a wrong that they see, but the rest of the world doesn't. There's the idea of an anti-hero being a villain. There's obviously a fine line that can be walked there. It doesn't take much to turn someone who's on the dark side of things to flip over to the bad side. Case in point. Um, so, and again, that's then the idea is, can the villain have a redemption arc? That's a huge thing that you can do in a campaign to bring in. How do we bring that villain back around? How do we reform them? How do we make them pay for what they've done, but do it in a way that really helps drive the campaign forward, or makes the party more powerful, or have better allies, or anything else? Um, so does the BBG have to be super powerful? Again, not necessarily. They can, yeah, super rich guy that commands horrendous people or monsters, or a king of a corrupt nation who just has everyone working for him, but because he's the king, he's up on a pedestal. Um, that's the idea that isn't so much that the 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 BBEG isn't so much the villain themselves, but all the organization around him that's doing terrible things. And what can really turn that around, which makes it very, very interesting, is the idea of Lex Luthor. He's not powerful in and of himself. He has no powers. He has money. He has people doing things for him. He's able to make bargains and make things happen there. But dealing with the guy himself, one on one without those things, is a cakewalk. It's all those resources he has that makes him difficult. So, and the idea that somehow that person who was normal suddenly does get power in some way, or finds a way to become as powerful as the party or as the other things that he's dealing with. And that sort of gives you a whole new aspect to that villain, and villains can grow and change too in your campaign. That'd be a fun thing to do as well. Uh, does a villain have to be limited to one? Can be a collaborative effect, like one on each continent or joining forces, or that can absolutely that can work structurally. Again, the idea that your Legion of Doom, where you have villains at all their specialties or different places, and that in order to deal with the whole problem that we represent is taking down each one of them. And it may be, yeah, they're all equal in power, but just have different domains of places to go. And so the idea that it isn't just one, it's a bunch that can be dealt with, and can be um, they can have their own sets of minions and their own things to deal with. And again, that's where you run into all kinds of fun with. You have your villain who's in a volcanic layer, and a villain who's in an oceanic layer, and a villain who's in a city, and a villain who's underground, and all these different locales that party can go to, and all these different environments they can play in to deal with these things that are all different problems. And then again, that's where they have to find different ways to deal with these different people and take them down. But the fun thing there too is that, again, like the villains are not static. They take down the first one, the rest of them know it's happened, and now they start shoring up their defenses or trying to go on the offensive against the party, sending people to take out the party and having all these different encounters along the way that are the rest of the villains trying to stop them from getting to them. So uh, again, fun ways to kind of drive a campaign forward, and there's all different ways to do that for depending on what you want to do. Um, my favorite type of villain to utilize in my campaigns. God, it's hard to say. The idea of like it depends on really the style of the campaign, obviously. Um, if you're talking about a very low magic campaign, a villain might just be like a giant who's got a lot of power and is just too strong to deal with. I like spellcasters in a fantasy setting, especially because they have a lot of different resources that are useful for them. Um, the idea that they have magics they can bring down in, they have time and minions to enchant things for them to make things more powerful. They can summon creatures to do things. Again, magic villains are really helpful in that regard, and even villains that aren't magical themselves often have magical allies, either spirits that work for them or wizards that work underneath them that are sort of like answer to them, clerics of evil gods that are sworn to their service or whatever. So the idea of magical villains that have magical resources, that's what I like for the most part. But you can also, again, it depends on where you are in the campaign. Again, villains can be like low powered. That bandit leader might be a villain, and he's got a number of bandits that work for him, and they're terrorizing a certain area. That's a low level villain that you deal with. And then working your way up to bigger villains and bigger, badder places to go. Um, it's it's when you get to that big BBEG, that's where you're talking about people that have a lot at their beck and call to do things. Um, and for me to fight, oh gosh, monstrous things. The bigger and badder, the better. In terms of like, I mean, fighting dragons is great, but fighting things with a lot of attacks and can do all kinds of crazy things. Um, I recently in a campaign we're right now fighting against plant monsters, and I used some similar aspects in last week's session in my game, where you take big nasty creatures and add more to them, making them more powerful and making them a more interesting encounter. So again, w- uh, with villains, you're often going to start with a basis. If they're going to be a spellcaster, they're going to be a powerful undead. They're going to be a giant tree. Uh, they're going to be something, maybe even a demon or some sort of extraplanar creature. But then what makes them a bigger threat is what else they have beyond what the normal versions they have. So the idea that they can summon up minions, or they can create followers, or they can cause environmental effects in an area. Again, those layer actions, those legendary actions, that's what makes a villain truly a threat. And so things that have a lot of varied, crazy type of attacks, things that have magic at the use for them, those are the kind of villains I like to use. And again, those are kind of fun, especially if you can do things tactically. They've got minions and stuff. You basically have to deal with those minions, and it's kind of like having cool MMO boss fights where you got multiple stages to deal with and different pieces to go after and things to avoid. That's what makes an encounter interesting. It's also makes villains interesting. More different things you have to deal with, and the more varied approach you have to use. You'd be thinking tactically. That's a lot of fun for me, especially. Um, let's see. So this next question here is a very interesting one here. How do you feel about one of the players being the BBEG? Um, or better yet, maybe is a player becomes a BBEG. This is something I've seen as well work there. It's hard to make someone who's in the party who's somehow like dumbing down their abilities in order to be a part of this lower powered organization. The only problem I see that is I wouldn't see that working for the BBEG, but someone working for the big bad. That's something I could see where this person's actually been working for the bad guy all along. That could be a lot of fun too. Or if something that someone that's lost shows up later on and now they're corrupted or something else. That can be a fun way to go too. Um, but again, obviously, if you're talking about doing this with the players, you run the risk with this. And so if you do something like that, you have to be very, very careful because the players, one, that player has to be really good at not metagaming and not giving too much away or doing something that's going to cause the reveal to happen too soon. Because when that reveal happens, when that player is outed, when that character is outed as a villain, they're not going to be with the party anymore. So now you're going to have to do something to get them away and bring in a new character for that player to play. And so that's it's a tricky thing to manage. It can be really fun and rewarding when it happens, but the idea that you have that all along, it's a tricky thing to manage. The other problem you're going to run into with that is the other players may resent what happens, depending on what's going on there. If this person, and the idea of like, you knew all along, you were in on this the whole time. It's not only a betrayal of that character with the party, it's kind of a betrayal of the DM because you planted this seed in their party and then screwed them over with it. So it really, Matt, it can be really tricky to make that happen in a way that doesn't leave bad feelings or a bad taste in everyone's mouth. So it's it's a great idea, but it's a tricky thing to pull off and not have the campaign fall apart or a group fall apart. If you have a group of people you trust and a group of people that are into what's going on, they may be some hard feelings initially and they might get over it and say, "Oh, that was pretty cool." But it is a risk. And so something to keep in mind if you do design something like that. Cool idea, but there are some risk factors to it there. So I would say be careful unless you know the group really, really well and think they could handle this. Because if you just spring it on a brand new group of people that may not know each other very well, it can be it can lead to some ugly time at the table, which isn't fun at that point. So again, it's there are it's something to be careful with if you are going to try it there. But it's a cool idea. I definitely have seen areas where that can work. Um, One fun aspect, and I've run this campaign, is the players are the bad guys. The players are the villains. It's an evil campaign, and they're trying to do things to set up a region. Maybe they're trying to take over a region, and they're dealing with the do-gooders and heroes and all the problems and how do they take over this government over here and topple this city state and it can be a really fun version of a campaign where the players are the villains. They get to enact these evil plans. They may have varying skill sets among them that while they're becoming more powerful and gaining minions and finding items to help them accomplish their goals, a villain campaign could be a lot of fun. And so the thing about that is, again, just like a normal campaign, the players are going to have their own motivations and their own goals and their own ways of doing things, and their own aesthetic. And so the evil campaign I ran was literally they were all agents of one of the big evil factions of the world. And Greyhawk, it was the Scarlet Brotherhood, who they love to just overturn governments and put in like double agents in places and find out information and do things like that. Well, basically, this one region, very remote area, the Scarlet Brotherhood wanted to establish a foothold in that place. So they sent in this team of agents who were all evil, part of their organization, who would then go in and first off find a base of operations, then see what factions there are in the area, what monsters they could recruit and bring into their organization, or take or dominate or get out of the way if they're a threat, and then how to deal with the local government and deal with the person running the largest settlement nearby. And so suddenly they're trying to like carve out territory and deal with rivals. And it makes for a very fun game. Again, it depends on the players you have at your table if they can handle that kind of a game. But if you have the right people, it can be a good time to be the villains once in a while. So it might be an option if you want to give it a try at some point. Um, so, question here: what are the differences in villains and their motivations and intentions? Should they be mutually exclusive? In the villains. So, their motivations. I'm not sure exactly understand the question there, but motivations and intentions. I think they're going to go hand in hand. And if you have villains that have competing motivations and competing intervention, competing intentions, that can lead to some fun ways of toppling one villain by using another. The idea that maybe these guys are bad guys, but this guy is worse, and so the bad guys might help the party. Like the like perfect example, Thieves Guild. In a lot of places, they can be considered bad guys. They do crime, they steal things, they kidnap people, they run drugs or whatever else they're doing. Um, depending on the type of Thieves Guild you have in your area, they're going to be considered bad guys. But let's say a corrupt baron takes over the city and is trying to like just wipe out any competitors. Well, one of those competitors might be the Thieves Guild. And so suddenly these guys who are really villains themselves have this other villain to deal with. And so now there's this opportunity for the bad guys to maybe even hire the party to deal with the bigger bad guy. And so the idea that enemy of my enemy is my friend uh, can really go a long ways toward dealing with multiple villains. They have competing interests. There's always villains who this one wants to destroy the world. I want to rule the world. You destroy the world. I got nothing to rule. Big clash right there. Again, those motivations. I want revenge on someone. Well, I want revenge on this villain over here. I'm doing it in a way that makes me a villain as well. But my motivation is to destroy that guy. So now you have again motivations that compete with each other that then set up opportunities to have differing interactions with different villains based on what they want. So, how to deal with the villain being too powerful and the party not be able to handle it? Well, really, depending on where you are in the campaign, the party shouldn't be able to handle it. The idea that a villain shows up, if the big bad shows up and the party's not prepared, they're going to need to run away. And that can be hard for some parties to do, but they better be careful because if the big bad shows up and they're level 3 and he's a dragon, an ancient dragon, it's going to stomp them. So they need to, and they can to get away. Or maybe they get captured by the big bag, and now that campaign takes a different way to go because now it's a matter of escaping, getting resources, and then come back and deal with them. So if the idea is that they get to the villain too soon, you have control over that. And that's where you might say that, hey, this guy's the bad guy. Wow, the party got to him. Let's not kill off the entire party and end the campaign right away. Let's make this guy a minion or a shadow. Like, let's say that they get to the bad guy, he's kicking their butts, but there's no way for them to escape, or they manage to even defeat him through some miracle of dice rolls and maybe good tactics. The idea that, oh, this wasn't the actual bad guy. This is just someone a look-alike. This is the handsome Jack's understudy. If you're familiar with Borderlands, it's somebody that it may be a clone. In terms of, I mean, D&D has the clone spell. So if your villain is actually dealing with a clone or a simulacrum, another version of magic in D&D, they can have a villain be in more than one place, or have a villain be, you take him down, but there's still another one who's still there. Or there's ways to bring people back in D&D. So there's a fun way that you can bring a recurring villain in where they show up, get defeated, show up again more powerful, get defeated, show up again more powerful. So now you're dealing with a layered villain who's not he doesn't have multiple lieutenants or multiple uh, um, uh, henchmen or else that. It's the same guy. He just keeps getting he's coming back more powerful each time. Again, a different aesthetic there. Um, let's see. And yeah, so yeah, if a battle takes place and you know going into this, they shouldn't be able to handle this, then again, you have the ability to back a villain off or just say, "You're beneath my you're beneath my notice," and he just swats them all away and leaves. Because why bother? Um, there's that kind of an aspect of like "Ugh, peons, and he leaves if he's that much more powerful. There's that aspect too, where it's like, you guys aren't a threat to me. Leave me alone and be gone. Or he just banishes them to an alternate dimension, and now you have a little side adventure of how to get back to your own world. Lots of fun things can happen there. If they confront the villain too soon, they don't have to necessarily be killed by the villain. They can be thrown in prison. They can be shunted off somewhere else. Lots of fun things can happen um, if they get there too soon. Let's see. Yeah. Can the BBEG be redeemed instead of killed? Absolutely. You get to the final ending there, and whatever you're doing, maybe they're corrupted by something, and you manage to destroy the thing that causes them to be corrupted. A redemption arc can be a fun thing too. The corrupted dragon who's actually just mind controlled by this horrible thing, and you break the control, and now the BBEG is suddenly like, I'm free, and thank you, and that can be a very satisfying ending to like. But then here's the fun twist to that. Where did this thing come from? What caused this problem? Is that something that needs to be dealt with? Again, next step in a campaign, what caused the BBEG to become corrupted in the first place? Now is a fun way to deal with that. Um, so uh, does there need to be a last big fight? It is a can be a fun, satisfying way to end a campaign. If you've been dealing with this problem all along and you're finally able to deal with it, that big bad fight there can be a fun way to go. But again, it doesn't have to be the end. If there's something beyond that, you can keep going. That's the idea is that you know the story. You know where things can go next. But if a campaign's been going on for a while and the players are high level and things are kind of slowing down, or maybe you want to take a break and move to something else there, this could be a fun thing of like, and you've won. Now what do you want to do? And then maybe sometime in the future you decide, oh, all you heroes who have been uh, retired and uh, living your ideal lives out in the countryside with your families or whatever else that the call goes out that the thing has returned or there's something else bigger and badder to deal with. So now you come out of retirement to come back in. And it may have been like months, weeks, months, even a year can go by, and you're brought back into a new adventure, picking up where you left off. So I think that evil guy is not necessarily the end, doesn't have to be. You can definitely have some fun times with where to go after the fight. Um, So, what makes a villain horrifying but also relatable? Whew. Um, Partially, what's going to make them relatable is actions. I'll say one of my favorite villains of all time. And if you played Borderlands, you know what I'm talking about here. Borderlands 2, Handsome Jack. He is horrifying. He is a terrible person, but he's funny and he does some really comically awesome things. And he's a great guy. Um, Having a villain give good one-liners, if you can come up with some good dialogue for your villain, that can be a lot of fun and making them relatable. If you can have some banter with the villain, that's a huge way to go to make them more fun and isn't just all doom and gloom and destroy and kill. It can be having a debate with them or having some sort of cool back and forth banter with them. Makes a lot of fun for a villain. And again, that's where that motivation and knowing your villain, if you know how they think, if you know how they act, um, then by all means, you can, even if you want, and I've done this in the past here, is jot down some catchphrases or some things they might say to the party during a fight, ways, some insults they might use, or some funny sayings they might have, or things they do with their villains, or things they do with their henchmen or their servants that make them more interesting in a way. It may not make them more relatable, but it might make them have more depth to them. How they interact with people outside of just straight combat is a great way to make a villain more relatable. And in terms of horrifying, I mean, obviously the physically horrifying, the cosmic entities, the demonic horrible things, and the layers they have, they're drenched in blood and spikes, and those are kind of the more can be potentially horrifying things about a villain. Can be their environment and their aesthetic. Um, but what can be fun there is a little juxtaposition of this very pleasant sounding gentleman, or this very lovely sounding seductive woman who's in this horrible place, and it's just like, oh, how does that almost breaks people's brains sometimes when you have that juxtaposition of what's terrible and what's seemingly interesting or charismatic. Like the charismatic bad guys are fun too, because again, they have that charming way about them that makes them more relatable, but they're still a terrible person. Again, fun things you can do with your villains there. Um, so I want to thank you, uh, Aaron, for all the questions here. You've been awesome. It's been great seeing them all coming through here. Um, but I think uh, those of you watching in the future, uh, if you can, in the discussion in the comments below here, add in some other ideas for villains. Add in some other things that you have. Um, uh, Add in some ideas maybe for other people. Like, here's a good villain to use, or even just to add in. Uh, like, think about some of the villains you've read about or seen on TV or seen in movies or seen in comics. What makes them good? And then think, how can I recreate something like that? You always have a great way to, uh, great models out there for villains. You don't have to be totally original. You can base things on something you've seen before. So villains don't always have to be come out of your head. If you know a villain from watching or reading them, by all means, use that as an inspiration. Use that as a way to really drive an idea of a villain home. Um, and uh, so I hope that this helps some way. It helps at least a little bit with kind of designing some villains, designing things like that. But again, it is hand in hand with your campaign. The villains are gonna what's gonna be set your campaign apart. They're gonna really be a part of what drives the players to becoming the heroes, or if they are the villains, what drives the players to acting out plans and making things happen. So you have these things to do. So I want so next week, just so we know here, we are doing a DIY edition talking about homebrew and different ways to homebrew items, monsters, things that you might find, ways to modify things you find in other sources, things to keep in mind when you do that there. And I might see if I can get some people to help me out on this with some ideas specifically and kind of go from there. Because I know some people out there that do some amazing homebrew stuff, do some amazing custom monsters, custom items. There's entire companies out there that do just that. That they, I mean, and we'll talk about that next week. There are some sources for what's not homebrew, but is something that's not in a core system, ideas or ways to tweak things. So we'll talk about some different ways to kind of get a homebrew feel to your items, maybe your locations, maybe your monsters. But yeah, it's our DIY edition for DM&D chat. So if you have questions or ideas about that, want to throw them out to a message, you can message me on Discord. Put a message on this video here, and join us for that coming up here in the future. Um, and let's see. or maybe one more question here before we wrap things up entirely here. Let's see. Uh, so introducing the presence of the bad guy again. It depends on what you want to go for. I've seen things where the bad guys show up right away, and that's how now do we deal with them? They show up, do some terrible things, and run and leave. And now the party is like, what was that? How do we deal with this? Or it's that slow introduction through the actions of their minions or the actions of what they're doing. Um, that's a fun way to kind of different ways of doing it. It depends on your campaign what you want to go for. And the last thing, what about maybe just intended to divide the players? What if some players agree with the bad guy and some players don't? That can set up a whole new fun way of doing things. And it can again cause issues with the party they're not if they're not aligned in their intentions, if they're not aligned in what they want to accomplish, that can cause some problems. And so it may be that the party divides into two parties and you have two campaigns. Um, if you have the luxury of time and the ability to do that, then that's awesome. Or maybe some party members leave and new party members come in. There's all things that can happen there. So again, that BBEG, that could be what splits apart a group and changes up your roster. We talked about that last week and keeping it going. That can cause some real issues if the party is split in their focus and everything else. So for that, go back to last week's episode of keeping it going there and check things out to see how you can kind of deal with some of those situations. And again, hopefully you come back next week for our DIY edition. Beyond that, we've got some other ideas. I'm tentatively going in the week after that with talking about magic, different ways to use magic in a campaign and how it can really drive your setting. Because fantasy is all about magic. And there's all different ways to incorporate magic in your world, even within D&D itself. So there's some fun things we're going to talk about there. So again, if you have questions, drop them out here from here on the video or in Discord on a DM. And I hope that you guys got some good information today. Hope you all enjoyed today's talk. And again, we'll see you again really soon. Stop by Saturday for Avarice, the Shattered World. And we're doing a little bit earlier tonight here, but I think we've kind of beaten this villain to death. So hopefully you had fun. We'll see you again really soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.